أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على أشرف خلق الله سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل. وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وصحبه الأخيار المنتجبين وعلى جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، يقول الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وفضل الله المجاهدين على القاعدين أجرا عظيما. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Quran chapter 4 verse 95. God has preferred with a mighty reward those who strive in the way of God over those who sit back. One of the most defining characteristics of the events that took place in Karbala on the day of Ashura, even the time before the day of Ashura and the time after the day of Ashura, was that it was a jihadi stance. It was a jihadi confrontation. It was a jihadi resistance by Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. Now, when we say jihadi, what does it really mean? What does jihad mean? Now, if I ask you what are the obligations that we know, conventionally people hear about what? The furu'ud-din. I ask you, what are these obligations? Or some of the obligations that we as Muslims have to observe. Right? All of us, we remember. Salat, prayers. Siyam, fasting. Zakat, alms tax. Hajj, pilgrimage. Amr bil ma'roof. Nahi an munkar. Khums, tawalli, tabarri. And then in the end we say what? Jihad. The first 9, most of us, we know what they are. We know a lot about them. But for some reason, not many of us have clarity about what jihad is. And maybe this topic, for one reason or another, tends to be not discussed, not spoken about, as if it's a taboo, especially in these countries here. Can't talk about jihad. It's an obligation that we have. What do you mean we can't talk about it? So there is a certain level of less or no clarity about this topic. Inshallah, what I'll try to do in this talk is to clarify a bit more about it. Why is it important really to know or to understand what jihad is? This obligation that we all have upon us. It's an obligation on our shoulders that we need to discharge, we need to observe, we need to do. What is it? Why is it important to understand what jihad is? Many reasons. One is to know who the mujahids are. Who is the true mujahid? Who is the true struggler on the way of Allah, on the path of God? If you don't know jihad, how can you know who the mujahids are? How can you know, for example, we have in the Quran and in the Sunnah and the Hadith, so many narrations, so many verses talking about the mujahideen. فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ, the verse I started with. All these verses that talk about the thawab, the reward, the ajr, the level, the status of the mujahideen. If we don't know what jihad is, how can we identify who the mujahideen are? Who are the mujahids? Are those who blow up people who are lining up for voting, for example, in a certain country? Are these mujahideen? Are mujahideen those, for example, who target certain groups in Pakistan just because of the way they look? Or because, for example, in other countries, just because the religion that they belong to, they're from a different faith. Therefore, we target them, we kill them. Are these jihadis? Are these mujahideen? We need to understand this. Do these qualify in the hadiths attributed to the Messenger of God, the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Where he would say that there is a door, a specific gate for Jannah or to Jannah, to paradise, that is called the gate of the Mujahideen, can be understood as a certain level of paradise, specific for the Mujahideen, for those who observe Jihad. Do those people qualify? Who qualifies for this hadith? Who are the Mujahids? Those who enter the paradise from that specific and special gate where the angels would be waiting and would be welcoming. Who are these Mujahideen? We need to know that. If we don't know what jihad is, how can we identify who the true Mujahid is? Number one. Another reason is also, why is it important to understand what jihad is to be able to confront the distortion that has happened. In the past couple of decades, we've been observing how, for example, when, let's say, ISIS commits certain crimes and atrocities, there is an insistence, you would notice an insistence from certain media outlets to say what? To say this is the Islamic State that are doing this. Who are those who are beheading? The Islamic State, not ISIS, the Islamic State. Who are those who are bombing? The Islamic State. Who are those who are shedding innocent blood? The Islamic State. There was an insistence by some media outlets to make this association. Jihad, they are jihadis, they are mujahideen, they are committing these atrocities. Coining this kind of, or establishing this association in the minds of people, that whenever they hear Islam, Islamic, Muslim, jihad, they have to think of what? Of the atrocities, of the crimes, shedding blood, beheading. Some have succeeded, actually. In some minds and emotions of some people, there is this kind of association. Emotional kind of dissociation from the idea of, or the term jihad even. This is why we see it here. Some people, they don't feel comfortable with mentioning the term jihad. Why? It's a result of these projects. It's a result of these actions. Insisting on smearing and distorting the lofty obligation of jihad. This is one thing. So it's important for us to fight this distortion, to understand really who are the jihadi movements. Another reason why it's important to understand and learn about jihad and what it is, and to have a clear understanding about what this concept is to know, where are we? We, people who are sitting here, listening, talking, people outside, where are we of all this? Are we mujahids or are we not? Those of you, for example, who write to their MPs to pressure them to force an arms embargo on Israel, is this jihad or is it not jihad? Those of you who boycott Israeli products or associations or institutions that are associated with Israel, is this jihad or is it not? Those of you who choose to divest their pension money, their stock investments, divest from banks that are maybe associated with Israel, is this jihad or is it not? If we don't understand what jihad is, how can we know whether what we're doing is jihad or not? How can we know whether we're fulfilling this 10th obligation of the furu' ad-din that we always mention and utter? How can we know that? Those of you, for example, who are maybe participating in demonstrations, protests, those of you who might be maybe pressuring the government or the MPs to de-proscribe certain groups who are proscribed unjustly, especially now in light of all the atrocities and the terrorism that we've seen from the so-called State of Israel. Is this jihad or is it not? That's why it's important to know what jihad is in the first place. Another reason why it is important to understand what jihad is to reflect on our imams. Our imams, the khulafa, the successors of the Messenger of God, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. What were they doing? Did they do jihad or did they not? Many of us think, yes, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali bin Abi Talib alayhi salam, yes, he did jihad. Imam al-Hussein, yes, it was obvious, a jihadi stance. But particularly for the imams after Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, some people might think that they were qa'ideen, they were those who sat back. They did not do jihad. Is this true? Is this the correct understanding? Should we not know the rights of the imams? Should we not know about them? Is this not a right that they have upon us? This is why it's important. So let me go to the topic of jihad. Let's go to Arabic, right? The Quran is a message, the message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the messenger of God in Arabia by the tongue of Quraysh, the Arabic language. So in Arabic, we go and try to understand what jihad means from the root word jahada. Jahada, yes? Which means what? Someone who struggled, who strived. So jihad, when you do jihad, linguistically now I'm talking, yes? Jihad is that action that you do that involves a certain level of struggle, endurance. You're striving to perform, to do something, to achieve something. For example, I strived for a week studying so that I passed exams. I strived for a day, working in the heat so that I can earn a halal or a decent living in the end. Okay? I strived, for example, or I struggled to wake up for Salat al-Subh. Some people maybe struggle. It's a difficult challenge for them. Okay? So that's where jihad is, linguistically. It means that it is something that you do when it is something that makes you exert a certain effort, certain endurance, certain challenge, certain pain that can go with it maybe. Certain level of struggle. This is jihad. Now let's go to the Islamic concept of jihad. In Islam, by the Quran and the Sunnah. What does Islam mean when it says jihad? Because for example, there are some terms that linguistically mean something, but in Islam we mean something else. Salat, for example, linguistically, it means connection, maybe, or dua, or praying, right? But salat in Islam, there's a certain concept that is these set of actions that we do. We call them salat, yes? Same thing with jihad. What does the Sunnah and the Quran mean when they say jihad? There are mainly three elements of a certain action that you do that would be identified and termed as jihad. Number one, the first element that has to be there is what? What was mentioned linguistically. The action that you do with a certain level of endurance, a struggle, a strife. That's one. One element that has to be in the action. The second element that has to be there is that it has to be done facing a certain enemy, confronting a certain enemy. You face an enemy with this struggle. And the third is that you do this for the sake of God, for the purpose that is godly, for something that pleases God. And by that we mean what? For the lofty purposes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to work towards. For example, when you work towards defending your people, defending your land, defending your house, defending your possessions, your wealth, your children, you're defending them. Okay? You're struggling. It's something that is not easy. There's a certain level of suffering that might come with it. Number one, so that's the first element. The second is what? You're facing an enemy that wants to maybe harm or confiscate your property, or steal your wealth, or harm your children, harm your country, invade your country. A certain enemy there. Three, you do it for the sake of God, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to be here. Allah does not want us to be humiliated in this world. Allah wants us to be living as free people, dignified people. This is an example. When you defend your land, defend your country. When you try to liberate your land, to liberate your people from slavery, from colonization, when you try to prevent any kind of invasion towards your country or your land, this is an example of jihad. When it is done, facing a certain enemy, and done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of God, for what pleases Allah, for what pleases God. This is jihad. These are examples of jihad. An important note here is that, jihad is a unique obligation. You can't say, for example, that, look, I am now paying zakat. I'm paying money. Sometimes, paying money is a struggle by many people. There's a zakat I have to pay. There's a khums that I have to pay. Maybe there's charity that I need to give to some people who are needy. There's a certain level of struggle that you have with your own self. Okay? So you say, okay, this is a struggle. And I'm doing it for the sake of God. Okay, but you're not doing it facing a certain enemy. So you can't say that the zakat is jihad. There is salat, there is zakat, there is siyam. Fasting involves also a certain struggle. It is difficult. You're doing it for the sake of God, but you're not facing an enemy with it. So you can't say, for example, that fasting is jihad. So jihad is a separate category. Yes, you might be paying some money that is charity. You're doing it for the sake of God. But maybe in the middle of a situation where you're facing an enemy, you're supporting someone who's facing an enemy. Yes, this would be then called jihad. It's important to distinguish these two things. Not everything that you do with effort and endurance is called jihad. There has to be these three elements: the endurance, for the sake of God, facing a certain enemy. Okay? So let me mention a few instances of jihad. When we say jihad, where are these applied? One is jihadun nafs. We've all heard of this. Jihadun nafs, struggling against one's own self. That's jihad, huh? That's jihad. When we say jihad is one of the obligations that we have, this is jihad. The Messenger of God, he defined it as jihad. We know this story that the Messenger of God was once, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was welcoming Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, a certain group of people who came back from a battle, and he said, welcome to those who have done the minor jihad, and now what is remaining on them is to perform the major jihad. And he was asked, and what is that, O Messenger of God? What is the major struggle? He said, jihadun nafs, struggling against your own selves, your own desires, your own whims. So there is a certain level of struggle there. Enemy. There's a certain enemy here. Enemy is what? Your own whims and desires and inclinations. The whispers of the shayateen. The shayateen, which could be the jinn or the ins. You could have a friend who is a human, who is shaitan. Shaitan doesn't mean a jinn, doesn't mean something that you don't see or someone you don't see. No, shaitan could be a friend of yours. Someone on the way. You might be going to the mosque. That shaitan friend would tell you, no, we have a football match today. Let's go and watch it. That's a shaitan from the humans. I'm going to, for example, pay zakat or give a charity or support, maybe pay with some money to support the displaced people of Palestine or Lebanon. Someone might say, no. Come on, buy something for yourself. Some clothes for yourself. That's more useful. That's the shaitan. So you're struggling. The jihadun nafs is to struggle against all these, and it's difficult. Sometimes you have to struggle against temptations. You're being given haram money. Sometimes a transaction that you might be doing, it's prohibited, it's haram. Maybe it's a riba, it contains usury. It brings you so much money though. But you struggle against yourself. You say, no, that's a temptation, that is shaitani, that's evil. I can't involve myself in it. This is where your deen, your faith comes and tells you, beware. Beware. It's a struggle. Continuous struggle. From the time you're born, at least let's say from the time you become baligh, from the time of your taklif to the time that you die. It's a continuous struggle against your own self. Controlling your desires, controlling yourself, being in control, controlling your anger, controlling your shahawat, controlling your eyesight, looking here and there. Whoa, it looks nice. This is very attractive. Well, it's haram. You can't look at it. It's a struggle that you have to have. You live all your life. A struggle against an enemy for the sake of God. That's jihadun nafs. That's an instance of jihad when we say jihad. Another instance of jihad is what? Or struggle is the armed struggle. This is very clear. I think most of the books of our jurists, they talk about this kind of jihad. It's probably the concept that many of us know, which is what? Holding arms, holding weapons, and defending your land, for example, against a certain enemy for the sake of God. Defending your family, liberating your land. It's a right that Allah guarantees for us, that Allah gives for us. It's a human right. International law says it's a right for you to liberate your land from occupiers, from invaders. It's a right that you have. It's a guaranteed right for you as a human. So this is known also as, or this is an instance of jihad. But there are other instances of jihad. And this is one thing that is very, very, very important. There's a broader, so jihad is a broad term. This is really my main point for this talk. Jihad is a broad topic. It's not only jihadun nafs. It's not only the armed struggle, the armed fight. It's much wider than this. It's much wider than this. Notice the Quran differentiates between two things. The Quran talks about jihad, struggle, strife, struggling on the path of God, and talks about qital, fighting. It doesn't confuse both. It doesn't confuse them. Some verses talk about fighting. Other verses talk about what? Struggling, jihad. It could be fighting, but it could be not. It's like death. You might die as a martyr, maybe being killed on the way of God, but you might die in other ways. Maybe in the hospital, maybe by some accident. So the struggle is one instance of jihad. It's not jihad, all of it. This is one very important point to remember. Jihad is any struggle that you face an enemy with for the sake of God. It doesn't have to be an armed one. It could be that you struggle politically. It could be that you struggle economically. It could be by writing, by education, by talking, by spreading knowledge. Facing the project of a certain enemy that wants to occupy you, or that wants to control you, or that wants to rip you of your culture, or your education, or your values, or your principles, that wants to subjugate you, enslave you. There are multiple ways that you might want to face this. Says who? That it's only the armed struggle. Economically, media, those who work in media, clarifying the truth. This is a jihad of clarification, jihad of tabyin. It's a jihad. Now, how many media outlets are there being funded by millions and billions of dollars and pounds? What for? To distort what Islam really is. I mentioned an example of the term jihad. Some people, they feel, it's repulsive to hear the term jihad. Why? It's because of these projects. We have to confront them. How do you confront them? By working in the media, by writing, by spreading knowledge. This is jihad. Says who? That jihad has to be armed struggle only. It's an instance. It's one instance. It's one way of confronting a certain enemy that wants to subjugate you, or that wants to humiliate you. Psychological struggle, psychological jihad. Sometimes you are facing all this media machine. How do you do it? Sometimes your resilience. You might not be doing something active, but you're being resilient against those who want to expel you from your land and home. You're just staying at your home with the intention that I'm facing that enemy. I'm not going to succumb to their project and their aims and give them the goals that they want of expelling me from my home. That's jihad. These are different instances of jihad. And this is very important for us to understand and to learn and to know. Why am I saying this? I'll mention a few examples or pieces of evidence from the Quran. Listen very carefully. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Furqan. Surah Al-Furqan is a Meccan surah. Is a surah that was revealed or started to be revealed in Mecca. And in Mecca, the first 13 years of the time of the revelation, not the last 10, the first 13, this was the Meccan period. And we know that in the Meccan period, fighting was not permitted. The Muslims did not have permission to fight. They did not have permission to fight. The permission to fight came later in Medina. Allah says in Surah Al-Furqan, in that surah, chapter 25, verse 52, speaking to the Prophet, فَلَا تُطِعِ الْكَافِرِينَ وَجَاهِدْهُمْ بِهِ جِهَادًا كَبِيرًا. So do not yield to the disbelievers, but strive greatly against them with this message. Is the messenger of God fighting them? There was no fight. But the Quran is saying what? Jahidhum, struggle with them. Perform jihad with them. What is he calling this jihad? Jihadan kabira. It's a great struggle that you're doing. It's a great struggle that you're doing. Again, it's a struggle facing temptations. The messenger of God, was he after money? They offered him money. Was he after leadership? They offered him leadership. A struggle for the sake of God against these evil beliefs and values and culture. This was the messenger of God's jihad and struggle. Unfortunately, some people confuse. Some people might say what? That the first period of the revelation, the Meccan period, was a period of no jihad, but jihad was in the period of Medina. That's a wrong understanding. Both jihad was always there. Yes, the period of Mecca, The siege of Abu Talib, 3 years. Suffering from hunger and starvation. What is this? Isn't this jihad that the Messenger of God faced? The beginning or the first years, they were tough. The toughest years that the Muslims faced. Very difficult. There was no armed struggle. It was called jihad. وَجَاهِدْهُمْ بِهِ جِهَادًا كَبِيرًا. Another evidence I want to mention is the second or another verse is in Surah At-Tawbah. Now, Surah At-Tawbah is a Medinan surah. What do we mean? It was revealed in Medina, or in the period of time after the Hijrah, to be specific. And that time, there were wars. There was Ahzab, Badr, Uhud. There was armed struggles that took place. But listen what this verse says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, verse 73. يا أيها النبي جاهد الكفار والمنافقين واغلظ عليهم. O Prophet, struggle against the disbelievers and the hypocrites. One phenomenon that appeared later in Medina that was not there in Mecca was what? Was the emergence of this group of people that were called the hypocrites, al-munafiqun. Those people who claimed that they embrace Islam, that they accept the message, that they believe in the oneness of God, they believe in God and the messengership of the messenger of God. But in their hearts, they didn't. They did it maybe out of fear or out of certain interests that they wanted to gain. But in their hearts, they didn't actually accept the message. These were munafiqun. They were present in the society of the messenger of God. They were present in Medina. And we know that the messenger of God did not wage any armed struggle against them, did not fight them by arms with weapons. He did not. They were in the community, in the society, in the Muslim community. The messenger of God did not involve in fighting them with weapons or with arms. Allah says what? Ya ayyuhan nabi jahid al-kuffara wal-munafiqeen. God is saying to the messenger of God, to the Prophet, what? Struggle with the munafiqeen, with the hypocrites. It's called jihad. The messenger of God, how did he face them? How did he face these munafiqeen? He faced them not with the armed struggle. He faced them socially with the social struggle, intellectual struggle. Trying to work on them, trying to fortify the Muslim community. That's called jihad, not an armed struggle. So these are a couple of pieces of evidence that I wanted to mention so that we understand that when we say jihad, it's a broader concept. It's a broader concept than the military action that many media outlets out there, they try to focus on. So that when you say jihad, people's attention goes to what? To the armed fights, to those people who are called mujahideen, who are calling or committing atrocities here and there. This is what they wanted to coin in our conscience. And this is something we should confront, we should fight, we should resist actually. By embedding the true understanding of the term jihad. So this is what jihad is. There are 3 elements of an action that you do that would qualify as being jihad. 1, it involves struggle, striving, endurance, suffering. Doesn't always have to be facing threats, but actually suffering by resisting the temptation. That's the first element. The second is that you do it facing an enemy. The third is that you do it for the sake of God, for the sake of Allah, for whatever pleases God. You might be doing things that involve a struggle, that involve what? Facing an enemy, but you don't do it for the sake of God. Well, that's not jihad. The 3 elements have to be there, so that this is termed jihad. So for example, now if you have some money, you want to build a mosque, it's a great action. It involves a certain level of striving and struggling. But is it jihad? It is not. Jihad is something else. For example, let's say if you give money to someone to marry, and this is a great action, a great act, it has a great reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, supporting the young people to marry. But it's not jihad. If you're educating people, if you're a teacher, it's a great work, it's a dignified action to do, to teach. It involves a certain level of struggling. You do it for the sake of God. But if you're not facing a certain enemy, it's not jihad. Yes, when you are dedicating your speeches to confront the plottings of the enemy or the intellectual distortions by the enemy, an enemy that wants to annihilate you, that wants to strip you of your values, yes, this becomes jihad. It involves a certain struggle. You're doing it for the sake of God, and you're facing a certain enemy with it. And it becomes a jihad. So the people who do jihad, the people who are mujahids, are those who decide that they want to take and accept the repercussions and accept the consequences of their stances. That it might be a suffering. It might be a suffering. When you decide, for example, that you want to write to your MP or that you want to participate in certain demonstrations so that we impose or the UK government imposes an arms embargo on Israel, isn't this putting yourself also in a certain level of risk? Isn't this you maybe struggling, walking in the streets and shouting? Isn't this a struggle? Isn't this facing an enemy? Are you not doing it for the sake of God? You're a mujahid. When you decide that a certain portion of your money you want to dedicate it for the displaced people of Palestine or Lebanon, isn't this something that is difficult that you're suffering from? Are you doing it? Are you not doing it for the sake of God? Are you not facing the plottings of the enemy with this? The Zionist project, the colonial project that intends to expel indigenous people from their homes and lands. When you decide to do this, you are a mujahid. You're doing jihad when you're speaking a word of truth. So that's jihad. So now we go to Ahlul Bayt alayhum as-salam. We go to our imams. Now tell me, Imam Zainul Abidin, what he did, was it sitting back or was it not jihad? Was there not a narration that tells us that afdalul jihad, the best struggle, is what? Saying a word of truth in front of a tyrant. Isn't this what Imam Zainul Abidin did, facing the government or the governor of Kufa or facing Yazid? Isn't this what Zainab alayhi salam did? Our imams were mujahids. I want you to reflect on every imam, on the biography of every imam, how they confronted the projects of the enemy that wanted to annihilate the value of Islam, to erase the name of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But today, whenever we hear the term Muhammad, we recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma sallallahu alayhi. This was a result of the jihad of our imams alayhi salam. Our later imams, the imams after Imam al-Hussein, Imam al-Hasan salamullahi alayhi, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam al-Hussein, all the imams after, they were mujahid, they were not qa'ideen, although some people want to show them and display them as qa'ideen, those who sat back. Hasha. So now, alhamdulillah, we know what salat means, we know what zakat is, we know what hajj is, we know what khums is, we know what amr bil ma'roof is, nahi an munkar is, tawalli, tabarri, right? And now we know what jihad is. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. صلوات.